Let's examine several of the major constitutional controversies as they rose historically in antebellum America. We are, very importantly here, not dealing with what was the most contentious of constitutional debates, and that is the subject of slavery. We covered that in a lecture last week. However, I want you to think about the two in tandem as we move forward. Keep in mind that constitutional concepts never exist in a vacuum. Whenever antebellum Americans debated federalism or separation of powers or any other issue, it had the potential to impact all constitutional controversies. For instance, questions about whether federal power extended to the building of internal improvements like canals and roads would necessarily extend the principle that common funds could be used to improve land in one or more states, which opened up the possibility that states might be treated unequally. This had implications for preferring one section over another, and potentially for devaluing, say, manufacturing, which was a northeastern concern, or stable agricultural production, which was a southern concern. So if one demanded an expansive view of the Constitution regarding something like the expenditure of money on internal improvements, it meant that they were in a bind if that same expansive interpretation was applied to other areas that impacted slavery in a way that they did not like. So say what you will about the vagaries of constitutional interpretation, but this much is true. It has to be at least moderately consistent, or it is not credible. Our task today is to see how these constitutional positions moved historically across early national and antebellum America. We must remember that the major constitutional controversies must be understood within their political context. Following the War of 1812, that political context was surging nationalism and the decline of the Federalist Party. The Federalists had staked too much on their opposition to the War of 1812, and in the wake of the war's successful resolution, they pretty much were over as a party. They were crushed in the election of 1816, and the Federalists did not even bother to run a candidate in 1820. They were dead as a political force. This did not mean, however, that the Federalist principles, especially that which regarded political economy, were dead as well. Recall that Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and John Quincy Adams were all now Democratic Republicans who believed in a Hamiltonian political economy. Together, they were the leaders of a nationalist faction within the Democratic Republican Party. They agitated in the 18 teens and the 1820s for three things. First, a national bank, second, a protective tariff, and third, internal improvements. This was covered in the latter half of the Week 8 Lecture 3, so revisit that lecture if you need to, but make sure that you understand this political context. The fact that James Madison signed the Bank of the United States into law in 1816 encouraged the surging nationalist wing of the Democratic Republicans. An internal improvements bill was passed and presented to James Madison, who vetoed it in 1817. Madison made clear in his veto that his opposition to the bill was constitutional. I will refer now to the James Madison veto message. To refer the power in question to the clause to provide for the common defense and general welfare would be contrary to the established and consistent rules of interpretation as rendering the special and careful enumerations of powers which follow the clause nugatory and improper. So Madison in here was still signaling that he was a strict constructionist. He also, in this case, is differentiating the spending clause from enumerated powers. And we have to understand here that he's looking at both constitutional structure as well as the text of the Constitution itself. If we turn to Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 1, we have this clause, which was the source of controversy. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, and imposts and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. But all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Those who were agitating for internal improvements focused on this clause that said that the spending clause was to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. James Madison was unwilling to extend the power based on that clause. Instead, he looked at the careful enumeration of powers in the remainder of Article 1, Section 8. Bracketed, of course, by the necessary and proper clause. So In this, James Madison is pointing to the careful enumeration of powers, whereas his opponents, Henry Clay chief among them, pointed to this clause in the spending clause itself, which said that the ability to lay the revenues could be done for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Congress appointed a committee to respond to Madison's veto. The committee was chaired by the Virginian Henry St. George Tucker. This was the son of the Virginian who had written the famous Commentaries on Blackstone, which had laid down the very principles of strict construction. But St. George Tucker's son, Henry St. George Tucker, blasted his opponents, who were claiming that he had abandoned Republican principles. In the construction of the Constitution, he wrote, there cannot be, a system of orthodoxy. Agreeing as we do in principle, there must always be a variety of application. The instrument, conferring upon us incidental as well as express powers, there must always be great differences of opinion as to the direct relationship and real necessity of the accessory powers. In this case, of course, he's talking about the discretionary power of Congress to spend money on the general welfare and the common defense. But Tucker's admonition was against the old Virginia school. This Virginia school, of course, had raised the hue and cry and would continue to raise hue and cry every time they felt that a broad construction of the Constitution was impinging upon states' rights. These were, of course, Spencer Roane, St. George Tucker, of course, Henry St. George Tucker's father, John Taylor of Caroline, and, of course, Thomas Jefferson. If you don't recall them, you might look back at the lecture where we talk about McCulloch v. Maryland and the furious response of the Virginia School of Strict Construction to John Marshall's expansive nationalist view. Now, part of what Henry St. George Tucker was doing was, in fact, putting the very idea of strict construction on trial. I quote again from the committee's report. There is perhaps no part of the Constitution more unlimited than that which relates to the application of the revenues which are to be raised under its authority. That power is given to lay and collect taxes, to pay the debts, and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. It would be difficult to reconcile either the generality of the expression or the course of administration under it with the idea that Congress has not a discretionary power over its expenditures, limited by their application to the common defense and general welfare. This issue was not ended by Madison's veto in 1817. In fact, it would be consistently brought up, and remarkably, on the same grounds over and over again. A similar appropriations bill came before James Monroe, who vetoed it in 1822 and wrote a lengthy veto message explaining why. With methodical precision, Monroe demolished every argument in favor of the ability of Congress to appropriate money for internal improvements. After establishing that there was no explicitly granted power in the Constitution to make improvements, Monroe noted that the power to declare war did not necessarily entail the need to build internal improvements. The regulation of commerce, Monroe further noted, did not necessarily entail its promotion. It extended only to the power to tax and to keep it free from state burdens. As far as the appropriation clause went, it could not extend beyond the enumerated powers that followed the taxing clause. Recourse to that section that we discussed before was of no use to Monroe. Thus, internal improvements had failed politically on constitutional grounds. It's important to notice here that Andrew Jackson would as well veto an internal improvements bill in 1830, and these would continue to be vetoed up through the 1840s. But Andrew Jackson's reading of the Constitution was not the same as the old Virginian school. True, in May of 1830, Jackson did veto the Maysville Road on the same principles that Monroe and Madison had vetoed internal improvements legislation before. The Maysville Road was a bill which authorized federal money to build a road entirely within the state of Kentucky. He invoked the same constitutional objections of Monroe and Madison. It did not hurt, by the way, that the Maysville Road was a pet project of Henry Clay's, and Henry Clay was, of course, one of the great rivals of Andrew Jackson, both in the election of 1828, well, for that matter as well, in the election of 1824, and he continued to be a rival of Jackson's in coming years. But Jackson also vetoed other internal improvement bills on the same ground. For instance, the Washington Turnpike and Road Company bill, a bill purchasing stock in the Louisville and Portland Canal Company. So this was not uncommon. Nonetheless, Jackson did sign into law an act for making appropriations for building lighthouses, light boats, beacons, and monuments. This Jackson distinguished from internal improvements on three grounds. First, every president from Washington on had approved of such legislation. Second, it was a stated constitutional duty of the federal government to regulate international commerce, and this was a power which arguably was excluded from state purview, unlike interstate commerce, in which a concurrent power existed in many cases, if not over the same subjects, then certainly over concurrent subjects. Third, it was good policy. This bill would cheapen imports, would increase exports, and otherwise benefit the commerce of the entire nation. Now, this is this look at internal improvements suggests that Jackson's constitutional thinking was in fact in line with the Jeffersonians who came before him, and in many ways, of course, it was. But Jackson was also a majoritarian, and majoritarianism was not simply about the political will of the majority winning on policy questions. There were serious constitutional implications for majoritarianism. And Jackson would resort to majoritarianism when he believed that the people's voice should be played out in constitutional debate. And this was settled, Jackson believed, in the role of elections. And this was not an uncommon view, of course. You can go all the way back to the election of 1800, which is seen as the voice of the people speaking out about Jeffersonianism versus federalism. You can look to the election of 1828 in a very similar way. Now, this would impact another major issue, and that is the role of the Second Bank of the United States. Now, Jackson quite famously hated banks. He felt that they were private concentrations of power, that the moneyed men who ran them used them to buy elections and to buy influence. His hatred was not solely for the Bank of the United States, but for state banks as well. Nonetheless, Jackson proceeded cautiously after his election. In his 1829 address to Congress, Jackson noted that, quote, both the constitutionality and the expediency of the law creating this bank are well questioned by a large portion of our fellow citizenry. And it must be admitted by all that it had failed in the great end of establishing a uniform and sound currency. So here's Jackson in his 1829 address to Congress announcing his constitutional and policy objections to the bank. Nonetheless, Jackson indicated in that message that he would defer to Congress if Congress, quote, deemed it essential to the fiscal operations of the government, end quote. Although here, he suggested that the institution would have to be brought within acceptable constitutional limits, whatever those were. So in 1829, we see Jackson the cautious, announcing his constitutional objections, but in a way deferring to Congress and asking Congress to fix constitutional objections with the bank in order to allow it to continue. In his next annual address to Congress in 1830, Jackson made some suggestions about placing some of the bank's powers into the Treasury, where public rather than private officers could make decisions. Nonetheless, Jackson appeared to be losing the public relations battle regarding the bank. It seemed a popular institution, and certainly the branch most responsive to public pressure, the House of Representatives, was stocked with the bank's supporters. Jackson continued to make ambiguous public statements, but he made it clear that his constitutional objections to the bank had not diminished. Henry Clay also wanted to secure the Bank of the United States, the second leg of his vaunted American system. And so Henry Clay made a political calculation along with the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle. Although the Bank of the United States was not due to be rechartered until 1836, he and his allies brought a rechartering bill up in 1832. The bank was popular, they reasoned. They were right in this sense. The bill passed both houses comfortably. And they also believed that Jackson would bow to popular sentiment and to congressional will. And if he did not, all the better. It would tank Jackson's re-election hopes. But Jackson vetoed the bank bill on July 10, 1832. His veto message was forceful and eloquent. It was authored by Roger Brooke Taney, but entirely reflective of Jackson's sentiments. The bank was bad policy, and it was subversive of the rights of states and of the liberties of the people. So by staking the veto on policy grounds, but also on constitutional grounds, Jackson was reaffirming his role as constitutional censor. Against those who pointed to McCulloch v. Maryland as having definitively settled the question of the bank's constitutionality, Jackson fell back on Madisonian departmentalism. The Supreme Court, he said, did not control the executive any more than Congress controlled the executive. He was of the opinion that the law was unconstitutional. The president had a right to his separate opinion. In fact, every officer sworn to uphold the Constitution needed to uphold it according to his own interpretation, not that of the Supreme Court, said Jackson. This departmentalist defense of the president's prerogative to assert constitutional vision was neither extraordinary nor controversial. Every president had done so from Washington on forward. Nor did it bring Jackson into collision with the Supreme Court, at least not on this issue. Quite famously, Jackson would impugn the court's authority by refusing to enforce its pro-nationalist rulings against Georgia in the matter of the Cherokee Nation and its right to govern tribal lands. Nor was Jackson's veto the end of the matter regarding the bank. The bank still exercised tremendous power, partially because it held the government's deposits and therefore controlled a large amount of capital. But the election of 1832 was largely fought on the question of Jackson's anti-bank stance, although other issues percolated, not the least of which was the nullification crisis, which we shall deal with in a later lecture. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Bank of the United States, had spent a lot of money in the 1832 election against Jackson. Evidence of this came to light in October of 1832, and Jackson announced to his cabinet then that he intended to remove the United States deposits from the bank. So the election of 1832, like I said, there are a number of other issues, Indian removal, nullification, but it's really the bank issue that animates a lot of that election. And certainly the bank's supporters believed that that would be the issue that the election of 1832 would settle. They believed that his ill-timed veto going into the election would really make it a referendum on Jackson himself. And of course, they had badly miscalculated. Now, Jackson's actions against the bank would continue along this vein, and in 1833, he ordered the removal of deposits. By 1833, the United States had $10 million in the bank, and this amounted to 1/2 of its deposits. Jackson's advisors warned him that removing the money all at once would cause a ruinous contraction of the money supply. So Jackson and his advisors, which included Attorney General Roger B. Taney, plotted to move the money slowly and to enable the state banks to ward off attacks by the Bank of the United States. Now, I won't go into how badly this goes for Jackson and for Taney. Suffice it to say that their policy was a bad miscalculation, and that they also faced down a president of the Bank of the United States, Nicholas Biddle, who deliberately contracted the money supply to create general hardship, which would make things politically difficult for Jackson. He admits this in private letters, so we know this is a matter of historical fact. And it worked. We have a banking crisis in 1833 and 1834. Henry Clay, in the meantime, worked at building a new coalition to oppose Andrew Jackson and his running of the Democratic-Republican Party. And by now, the Democratic-Republican Party was known solely as the Democracy. It contained everybody. It was the single party. He was the heir to Jefferson, and there were no other parties around. But in 1833 and in 1834, Henry Clay put together an unlikely coalition. It involved the Nationalists, Nullifiers in the South, Anti-Masons in the North, people who were united in their hatred of Andrew Jackson. They came together as the Whig Party, and this was a brilliant use of rhetoric. They were invoking the idea of the Whigs, those who had opposed King George III back in the 18th century. The Whig Party made a surprisingly good showing in 1834 and 1836, and it was solidified then as the major national party opposing Andrew Jackson and the Democracy. So any dream that the founders had of a partyless state, and the Constitution very much contemplates a partyless state, was over, and obviously over, by 1836, when the Whigs and the democracy had risen as the second of the party systems within the United States constitutional universe. And this, by the way, largely coalesced around these constitutional issues which we have mentioned, that over internal improvements, a bank, the tariff, and other matters of political economy in the United States.